Well, a happy St Andrew's Day to you all, and welcome to this Politeia webinar, which we have titled A Disunited Kingdom, Is the UK's Constitutional Architecture Fit for Purpose, and How Secure is Scotland's Place in the Union? A warm welcome to all of you joining this event live, and also to those of you who are watching afterwards on YouTube, because we are indeed recording proceedings, just so you know. Now, while it was more than 2 decades ago that power was devolved from Westminster to newly elected bodies in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, one might observe that for many of us south of the border in particular, it's taken the COVID pandemic to realise the extent to which different laws, rules and regulations are made and applied in the constituent nations of the United Kingdom. The Holyrood administration has, of course, been run by pro-independence SNP government since 2007, who then in turn failed to persuade the Scottish electorate to back independence back in 2014. But the tension between the governments at Westminster and Edinburgh now has arguably never been greater, with it being reported earlier in the month that the Prime Minister had opined in a private meeting that devolution had been, I quote, a disaster north of the border. Of course, the inevitable clarification followed, which indicated he'd been referring to the way that the SNP have handled devolution in Scotland, and that he doesn't want to oppose devolution as a concept. Nonetheless, there are some big questions on our agenda today. What has the handling of the COVID pandemic at Holyrood and Westminster respectively shown us about the effectiveness of the current devolution settlement? Is the balance of powers between different institutions at different levels correct? Has government in Scotland become too centralised? Is the UK's current constitutional architecture strong enough to hold the union together? And what is the impact of Brexit on the debate about Scottish independence? To answer those questions and more, we have 3 distinguished speakers with us today. Daniel Robinson, Dr. Daniel Robinson, currently a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford. He was between 2016 and 2017 Senior Policy Advisor to Cabinet Office Minister Ben Gummer, where he was responsible for union and devolution policy. Daniel is author of Natural and Necessary Unions, Britain, Europe and the Scottish Question, which was published earlier this year. Secondly, we have Charles Livingstone, a partner in the Government Regulation and Competition team at Brodie's LLP, Scotland's largest law firm, where his responsibilities include advising clients on constitutional matters, such as the limits on the Scottish Parliament's powers. He's also the co-head of Brodie's Brexit Advisory Group and a regular commentator on the legal issues related to constitutional change. And thirdly, we have Tom Harris. Tom was a Labour MP between 2001 and 2015, where he represented Glasgow Cathcart and then Glasgow South, and he served as a minister in the governments of both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. After his enforced departure from the House of Commons, he became campaign director for Vote Leave in Scotland during the EU referendum, and is now a Telegraph columnist. I'm going to be asking each of them to speak for 8 to 10 minutes, after which I will open the discussion up to you, and you'll be able to use the chat function to submit any questions to the panelists, or once we reach that stage, use the button to raise your hand and attract my attention. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Daniel Robinson to open proceedings. Daniel.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a great pleasure to be having this conversation tonight. I hope it's the first of many over many years. So I wrote this book, which I finished round about March, and then COVID happened, and I was pretty confident of 2 things. Firstly, I wouldn't sell a single copy. And secondly, the Scottish separatist movement was dead for the time being. One of those predictions was probably closer to truth than the other. Since I'm speaking first, I think I am under some obligation to talk about where we are now. We've broken new territory in 2020. It's the first time there've been sustained, sometimes quite wide margins for separation in opinion polling. You know, between the referendum in 2016 and the end of 2018, if anything, the polls moved more in a unionist direction. And at the end of 2019, they were still pretty close to where they were at the end of the referendum campaign in 2014. You'd need a prophet rather than a historian to explain why COVID-19's had this effect, and perhaps more importantly, whether that effect will be permanent or whether we'll move back to some kind of normal next year. as we move from the biological period of the pandemic towards the economic period of the crisis. Maybe pandemics encourage people to think in more closed border terms. Very distant comparison. My old boss wrote a book on the Black Death. Scottish chroniclers then used to refer to it as the foul death of the English. It could be more charitable. There's no question that the SNP has been much more media savvy in its handling of the pandemic than Whitehall has. But I still think we need to keep all of this in perspective. It didn't take COVID to give the SNP more than 40 of the Scots seats in Westminster in the 2019 election, just as it didn't take Brexit to let the SNP more or less sweep the board in 2015. And of course, they've held power in Holyrood one way or another for about 13 years now. I guess we've got to ask ourselves the question, what's the point of a constitution? Several answers to that. I'm quite fond of this one. It's so that political societies can endure crises intact. We're doing pretty poorly at this. Each of the big crises that the British state has faced in the last decade or so, the recession, Brexit, and now the pandemic, has raised fundamental questions about the integrity of the United Kingdom. It's a great shame because in other respects, it's still a very, perhaps even singularly successful union. We've seen that in the last few months, a kind of economic risk and burden sharing that very few other unions, even federal unions, elsewhere in the world can manage. I think the economic case for the union is pretty well unanswerable. Problem with that is making that kind of argument, well, it's about as stupid as the old line about Brexit, that Brexit voters voted against their economic interests. It's not about that. What I think unites a number of the great political crises we've seen in the last decade or so is a single theme, and that is the theme of self-government. You know, opinion polling, opinion surveys over many decades now have been united in recognizing a vast and growing discontent, frustration, with a kind of feeling of mass and popular impotence. Devolution, I think, was a tremendous idea, but I think we can say with confidence that one thing it didn't provide was a sense of security and comfort for a lot of Scots within the framework of the United Kingdom. More than that, there were respects in which it simply encouraged a kind of populist politics. You know, we paid very little attention to the kinds of checks and balances that are typical in constitutional theory, and we've ended up with a government that's got a pretty meager legislative record. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it spent a lot of time grandstanding when it could have been legislating. The division of taxation powers and spending powers creates, you know, very muddied lines of accountability. There's a reason why, notwithstanding the devolution of healthcare policy, Alex Salmond was able to use healthcare funding so effectively in the 2014 referendum. And, you know, within Scotland as well, there's the question of the powers of the councils, who are responsible for spending almost half the public money spent in Scotland, who've had their powers tightly constrained by Holyrood. And then we've seen in the last few months, particularly the imbalance that comes from the British government having to also act as the government for England. I was at a conference back in February. One of David Cameron's old advisors said, it's ludicrous to imagine that Mrs. McGuinty is losing sleep at night thinking about Kentish liberty. That's almost certainly true, but it's also true that the structure of the United Kingdom as a whole and the structure of politics in England has an inevitable effect on the way devolution is perceived in Scotland. All of this is manna for nationalists and national separatists. But there's far too much declinism and fallism in British politics today, so I don't want to dwell on that any further. So I think, if you'll allow me a few words of suggestion, that we can speak in more optimistic terms. I think the United Kingdom's in the middle of a great revolution in the way that it's governed. And that revolution's been going on for at least 20 years. I think we're probably living in the age of the end of the new governance, the new public management, the decline of technocracy in layman's terms. I don't think we're living in the beginning of the rise of populism. At least we won't be if we can adjust our institutions to give people a sense that they are more in control of their country's affairs than polls have tended to suggest they felt for quite a long time. If I'm right about that, then Scotland is in the vanguard, not for the first time of its history, of a brave experiment. And foundational to that bravery will be the courage to realize that self-government isn't necessarily the same thing as separation. You know, you use a phrase like independence in the United Kingdom, and it sounds like a paradox today, but for most of the history of our union, that was the very thing that the union was there for. It was to provide Scots with a way of escaping English domination, a way of protecting their own institutions, and a way of asserting their own interests in the British Isles. There was never a unitary state in this country. Certainly never an imperial one since 1707. But I think there's something standing in the way of any progress that we could make in that direction, and that is, frankly, the referendum. I think a lot of Brexiters would agree with me that it's now a closed book. Referendums ask more questions than they answer, and they sow more divisions than they heal. They take us away from the things we used to call politics, right? Institutions, representation, legislation, negotiation. There are all sorts of very fertile ways in which we could be addressing the Scottish question today. Citizens' assemblies, referendums with actual formed questions rather than things that just invite statements of value. I think if you ask a people if they should be independent, and that's an emotive term, over and over again, in the end they'll only give you one answer. Great French philosopher Ernest Renan famously described a nation as a daily plebiscite, but he didn't suggest holding them. Scotland's been asked that question every day now for almost 7 years. And that in itself, I think more than anything, is the problem in our politics today. And it's bound up with the limits of the Devolution Settlement, and it's bound up with our failure to integrate that settlement into the architecture of the United Kingdom. I've probably more or less had my time, so I'll just leave it at that, Jonathan, if it's okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. Could I invite Charles to unmute himself and to give us perhaps a bit of more of a legal perspective on where we're at?
Thanks, Jonathan. I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't start with the disclaimers. So I'm speaking in a personal capacity. So my statements are not reflective, should not be reflected on Brodie's or any parts of our practice. I should also say that I've certainly accepted the premise of the questions that have been put to the panelists, and that they are from a unionist perspective, but Brodie's doesn't take a position on those sorts of questions, and I follow suit, at least in my public appearances. So to go through the questions that were put to us, I think in terms of the handling of COVID-19 pandemic and the different handling on each side of the border, I think it has demonstrated the differences and the extent to which devolution extends differences to Scotland that don't and permits Scotland to take a different approach that doesn't apply in the UK. I think, as you suggested, Jonathan, that was probably underappreciated before. From some of the sources I read, I think it was underappreciated even within the UK government. For example, on the question of travel restrictions, the expectation seemed to be that those would be decided at a UK level because they were to do with borders, when in fact the way they're implemented are as health restrictions. And so the Scottish Government was able to have a different list of quarantinable countries than the UK government did. I think generally the different responses have shown, and not specific to a pandemic, but particularly acute in a pandemic, is the tension between needing to have a joined up approach and also needing to respond to local circumstances, which I think is illustrative of the tension inherent in devolution. It also, I think, the different approaches have highlighted that the differences go beyond just questions of legal powers and the law. So one of the things that we have found most striking in advising clients over the course of the year is that the law, the restrictions that applied in Scotland and England, and I'm going back more to sort of March, April now, the actual legal restrictions that applied were not terribly different. The Scottish regulations were stricter in one or two respects. But the guidance and the attitudes and the messaging from the Scottish Government and the UK Government were starkly different, with the Scottish Government advising far more businesses simply to close outright than the UK Government was. Construction sites among them, but also lots of UK-wide businesses who had real trouble understanding why there was such a difference between the law and the rhetoric, when the law in each place was fairly similar, but the guidance was very different. So I think devolution has highlighted that as much as it has differences in legal powers. In terms of the balance of powers, the question whether the balance between different institutions at different levels is correct, and that relates very closely to the question about whether the UK's constitutional architecture is strong enough to hold the union together. So I think there are political decisions and judgments at the heart of where powers sit, which are not really for me to comment on, but from a legal and constitutional perspective, I think it is noticeable, and I've possibly noticed it the more I've thought about it for the purposes of today, that discussion about the balance of powers really only runs, and is really to some extent only permitted to run in one direction, in the sense that there has been since 1999 a great deal of devolution, large and small additional powers going to the Scottish Parliament, but the only re-reservation that I can recall where something went back to the UK Parliament was Antarctica. My understanding is that was correcting an administrative oversight rather than due to any fears that the Scottish Government was about to launch some sort of expedition to Antarctica or claim a slice of the British Antarctic territory. So I think that illustrates that the discussion is generally one directional. As a result, whatever devolution happens to be at any one time tends to be referred to as the Devolution Settlement. I mean, that's become a sort of cliched description of it, but if one thinks about it, it's an odd description to use of a constantly moving position. But as a result, the discussion takes the form that further devolution to the Scottish Parliament is evidence of the process, as Ron Davies called it, the devolution process operating as intended. But any suggestions of movement in the other direction is a constitutional affront. And as a constitutional lawyer, that is very much the approach taken in my particular milieu within Scotland. And it's worth saying that is not limited to the SNP in Scotland. I think you see something very similar from Welsh Labour at the moment, who, as I understand it, is still a unionist party. But I think it's consistent with sort of James Madison's observation, and Daniel mentioned checks and balances, but the observation that people in positions of power within institutions will tend to jealously guard the rights and privileges and powers of those institutions, and by extension of themselves. But I think it's probably indisputable that the position of the SNP in the Scottish Government and the Conservatives in UK Government makes that contrast and that clash very stark indeed. So connected to that is the question of architecture. And again, taking the premise of the question, is it strong enough to hold the union together? Well, time will tell, or it's too soon to say, as a famous response goes. But I think on that premise, I don't think one could say it's doing a very good job. On whether the premise is correct, I think there obviously was an intention. There's the famous statement from George Robertson about devolution going to kill nationalism stone dead. So on that premise, it was clearly the intention that devolution should help preserve the union, but it's rarely been said that the principle of devolution is to give Scots more control over intra-Scottish matters, consistently with maintaining, with the maintenance and the proper functioning of the union. I think that second part may well have been part of the idea, but it's rarely stated. So I don't think it carries a great deal of weight in argument from a constitutional perspective. And in terms of the Scotland Act itself, we're getting really into the legal details there. And my comments here are based on a combination of sort of reported history of the background to the Scotland Act, theories that I've read from others, and my own inferences from both of those. But the Scotland Act, in my view, was its defence of the Union, or its protection of the Union, was kind of premised on two main assumptions. One was that because of the electoral system, no party could win a majority, and therefore the SNP would never be in power, or at least would never be in power without being tempered by a unionist parliamentary majority or coalition partner. And the second defence, or the second assumption, was that the UK would remain part of the EU, and therefore there was no need to worry about significant barriers to intra-UK trade, because EU law would take care of that. And I think if not for those two assumptions, the Scotland Act would be a very different looking piece of legislation. But if those are the defences, they're a little bit like a Maginot Line theory of defence, in that if they are either overrun, as the SNP has overrun the PR system to gain majorities in Parliament, or bypassed in the way that Brexit has bypassed the EU law assumption, there is then a lot of room for conflict in behind. And that connects to the final question about Brexit. And I'll leave the economic, political, moral arguments to others. But legally, Brexit and the fact that the Scotland Act contained that assumption about EU membership is the reason for the current internal market bill, leaving aside the aspects about the Northern Irish Withdrawal Agreement. The internal market bill, and also the freezing powers in the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, which caused a great deal of controversy at the time. So the question of Brexit, it has a live impact on the independence debate, but it is also separate from independence per se, but does contribute to the current stresses on the system just as much as it does to the independence debate. In terms of centralisation, just briefly touching on that question, I think it's frequently stated, to the point of cliche, that Scotland is one of the most centralised countries in Europe. Cliches tend to become cliches because they have some truth to them, though. If you were to ask COSLA, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, or SOLAR, the Solicitors Local Authority agency or representative body, or any council, many of whom are our clients, they would tell you that government in Scotland has become too centralised. There is no general welfare power for councils in Scotland in the way there is in England. There have been policies imposed, such as the council tax freeze, in which any increase in council tax would be met by a reduction in funding for other matters, such as funding to support Scottish Government policy on reduced class numbers. There's an increase in ring-fenced funding. Police and fire services have obviously been centralised. It doesn't run entirely in one direction. The Education Governance Review, the Scottish Government proposal, was to delegate authority to head teachers to implement the national curriculum, which is set centrally. There was a lot of opposition from that at local government level. To some extent, it runs a little bit in two directions. It moves power downwards from local authorities to implement central government positions, but in both directions is at the expense of local government. So I think there's certainly been a trend of centralisation in Scotland, and there has also been a trend away from local government in both directions to some extent. So I think I've taken up my time, so hand over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Charles, very much indeed. Now I'll give the floor to Tom Harris. Tom.
Just want to double check, can you hear me all right? I've put on my telemarketing paraphernalia, and I really enjoyed those first two contributions, but you have to forgive me because I'm going to bring the tone down a bit and start talking about more party political stuff as befits my status. Because during the 2016 EU referendum, I was invited in my role as the director of Scottish Vote Leave to a business breakfast in Edinburgh to debate the issue with John Edward, who was my opposite number in the Remain campaign. And I was asked this question by one of the attendees: if the UK votes Leave and Scotland votes Remain, won't the SNP demand another referendum? And the answer, of course, was yes. Of course, the SNP would use a result like that to push the case for a rerun referendum. I also pointed out that since the first independence referendum less than 2 years earlier, Alex Salmond, who was then no longer the SNP leader but was the party's foreign affairs spokesman at Westminster, had already suggested that other factors would justify a rerun referendum. The renewal of Trident was one of them. The continuation of Tory austerity was another. I suggested that David Mundell looking at Nicola Sturgeon in a funny way might be considered another excuse for a second once-in-a-lifetime referendum. In fact, 9 months before the EU referendum even took place, on the first anniversary of the independence referendum, Nicola Sturgeon told the Scottish media that she would use her forthcoming conference speech to lay out her strategy for obtaining a second one. And we have to be clear about this. There is no alternative reality in which the SNP placidly accepted the result of the 2014 referendum. An SNP that doesn't demand independence every day of every year is an SNP without any purpose. And an SNP leader who doesn't prioritise a rerun referendum will very soon be an ex-leader. And if another referendum were ever held and there was another no vote, there is not the slightest prospect of the SNP accepting that result either, or of them not campaigning for a third one. As for the question of whether Brexit itself has turbocharged the case for independence, I can accept there's been an increase, an undeniable increase in support for independence since June 2016, maybe by about 5 or 6 points. Let me point out also that devolution itself has been a far greater boost for the nationalists. In 1999, according to the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, 27% of Scots supported independence. By September 2014, that had risen to 45%, an increase of 18 points. It would be absurd, blinkered, to claim that independence is definitely not going to happen. Political facts of life forces at least to consider the possibility. But if independence is to be achieved, it's not going to happen because of the efforts of the nationalists. It will happen because of the misjudgments of unionists. We've been given a get out of jail free card when it comes to a second referendum. Sturgeon and Salmond said repeatedly during the first referendum campaign that this would be a once in a lifetime event, and they said that for 2 reasons. The first, and for them it was the most important one, was that they needed to motivate soft nationalists to get out and vote, and they couldn't do that by even hinting that a second chance to vote for independence might come along in a few years. The second reason was that even they recognised that constitutional referendums are important. They are profound. They impact on a country's economy and its international reputation. They are historic, and therefore they cannot be wielded lightly. They were right then. They are wrong now, if only unionists would recognise that. Donald Dewar deliberately framed the Scotland Act in such a way as to ensure that the decision about such referendums lay exclusively with Westminster, not with Holyrood. The obvious intention, even at the time, was to allow the UK to frustrate a nationalist majority for independence. And the SNP voted for that act. So what happens when, as was always inevitable, the SNP start agitating for a rerun referendum? The unionists do what they've done for decades. They capitulate. They help the SNP out, and they do it in 2 ways. First, they concede a falsehood that a material change in circumstance would justify another referendum. I've got no doubt that when the SNP came up with that soundbite to justify reneging on the previous once-in-a-lifetime promise, they assumed no one would buy it given the supreme level of dishonesty and cynicism it represented. But they hadn't taken account of the unionist community's desire to prostrate itself before the forces of nationalism. The only thing that gives some unionists more nightmares than independence is the prospect of being criticised by newspaper columnists and strangers on Twitter for not being democratic enough. So more than a few leading unionists started to concede publicly that Brexit, after all, might justify another independence referendum. And to compound their capitulation, they started accepting the truly bizarre and paradoxical notion that a vote in an election for a devolved parliament can give a party a mandate in a matter that is completely reserved. The appetite of some unionists for allowing nationalists to set the rules is truly remarkable. David Cameron conceded that Alex Salmond's majority at the 2011 Scottish Parliament elections, in which he campaigned for a referendum on independence, should be respected. One of the most powerful arguments in Cameron's favour was not Salmond's majority. It was that such a referendum had never been held before. The Scottish people, although voting consistently for parties which supported the Union up until that point, and incidentally ever since, had nevertheless not been given an explicit say on the issue. After the 2014 referendum, that crucial factor no longer applies. Let me assure you, the nationalists are laughing at the heartlessness and the lack of backbone among unionists, as they should. They can't believe that unionists either contemplate publicly the notion of conceding another referendum when there's a far stronger case for denying it, or, arguably even worse, they fret about their unhappiness with the union itself. Unprepared to defend the union as it is, they advocate yet another tranche of devolution, usually labelling it federalism and referring to the status quo as broken. And then they wonder why the Scottish public support for the union is declining. In the fraught weeks following the 2014 referendum, I attended a meeting of Scottish Labour MPs at Westminster, where a response to the referendum was discussed, specifically the conclusions of the Smith Commission on more powers for the Scottish Parliament. And I asked the leadership to name just one occasion where a granting of extra powers for Holyrood had resulted in a stronger union. I'm still waiting for the answer. Given the level of argument among unionists who should know better, I am astonished that support for the union in Scotland is as high as it is. Recent history has shown us that the union really is in trouble and that it might be lost. It's also shown us that capitulation unionism cannot defend it. And it's time unionists grew a spine and started having confidence in their own argument and, most importantly, in the union. Because if we don't believe in it, why on earth should we expect anyone else to? End of St Andrew's Day rant.
Thank you, Tom, very much indeed. Thank you to all our panel for those opening contributions. So I am keen for interaction with you who are watching, and I can see a hand up from the person who I can only call the other Tom Harris, because there is another attendee of today's event who shares your name, Tom. So, Tom, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Happily. Thank you, Jonathan. I couldn't resist it because the opportunity to speak to my namesake was too much. I think we were both parliamentary candidates in 2001. I was unsuccessful. Tom, you were successful, and then we might have been on opposite sides. But having listened to you, I don't think you could get much between us, both on Brexit or on the case that you've just made. So thank you very much. My question is mainly addressed to you, with apologies to the other panelists. And just picking up your theme of the spinelessness of unionism, parts of the problem surely is that it's fragmented between Conservative and Labour. And at one time, the Conservative Party was fairly dominant in Scotland, if you go back to the 1950s, and then much more recently, the Labour Party was in urban areas. That's allowed the SNP really to dominate one side of the debate, with the other side being fragmented. As a former Labour Member of Parliament, would you agree that it's very difficult now for the Labour Party to dominate the unionist side and become the unionist party? Should the Tory party in Scotland revert to the name Unionist Party and seek to become the flag bearer of unionism in Scotland? And could it not, at the same time, repeat the trick, as it has in the so-called red wall seats, of essentially pointing out that the Labour Party really represents North London, Oxford and Cambridge, and a woke agenda, which presumably doesn't appeal much in Glasgow, Cathcart, or in many other former Labour seats. And that the Conservatives have an opportunity to repeat their North of England trick, north of the border. Sorry, I don't want to talk too long, but the other sort of theory I've had in my head, and I'd like to just ask you to comment on it, is that actually Brexit shoots the nationalist fox in the long term. My view has been that local nationalisms are puffed up as power goes from European capitals to Brussels. But the reverse is true, that as power comes back to Westminster from Brussels, gradually the appetite for nationalism will diminish, and that Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP realise that, and that accounts to some extent for their desperation to get another independence referendum on the agenda as quickly as they can. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shall I answer that?
Yes.
I won't take up too much time. It's really nice to meet you, Tom. I do now remember that there was another Tom Harris, and I was so glad that you didn't get in, simply because I was able to get that Twitter name without any competition. On the last question first, it's absolutely true that the SNP were desperate. They were claiming to have planned for a referendum this year before Brexit happened, because they knew that there was a danger for their agenda if there were extra powers devolved, repatriated from Brussels in terms of fishing, environment, agriculture, etc. They didn't want those powers repatriated because they knew that, or they feared that that would diminish the case for independence. I'm a bit wary of people saying that this or that argument would kill, ever since, you know, I think it was Charles that mentioned George Robertson's comment back in '95 that Scottish devolution would kill the SNP stone dead. I've been wary ever since of any arguments that says that this or that argument will demolish or take away the agenda from nationalism. I keep hoping for that to happen. It seems to, I'm disappointed each time. As far as the Conservative Party is concerned, I mean, you're right, there is a real opportunity for them now to make advances in Scotland, because the Labour Party really has given up the ghost, even after the departure of Corbyn, who had no love at all or affection, loyalty to the Union. He saw it as an imperialist construct. But even under Keir Starmer, I mean, there are very few signs that they are willing to actually take a stand in defence of the Union. They're willing to take a stance in defence of a hypothetical, imaginary future Union that doesn't and will never exist. They're quite happy to defend that. But as far as defending the Union as it exists, or the Union as it has been, they are a lost cause, I'm afraid. So yes, there is an opportunity for the Conservatives. You know, in 2015, I lost my seat along with 40 colleagues, simply because of what you say, that everyone who'd voted yes voted SNP, that was 45%, and everyone who voted no, 55%, split their votes among the three main unionist parties, which is why we ended up where we ended up. If the Conservatives are willing to pick up the unionist torch that the Labour Party has dropped, then good luck to them.
Thank you very much.
Daniel, Charles, did either of you want to reply to either of those points from the other Tom Harris? Daniel, I can see you do.
You know, just I agree with pretty well all of that. But I mean, we do have this question of, there's a constitutional reality and there's a political reality. And the political reality is the SNP has extremely powerful rhetoric and talking points at its disposal. You know, it's been able to say 2014 is a Pandora's box in a very fundamental sense. They can point to the fact that on at least one day, there was a Scottish nation and it was sovereign. That, I think, fundamentally alters the nature of the nationalist debate in the last 5 or 6 years. And for various extremely complicated socio-cultural reasons, you know, you can't meet nationalism with nationalism. You can't stand up and defend Britain in the way that it's become possible. I regret this immensely, to make nationalist cases for Scotland as a separate entity. That's why, I mean, you know, just coming back to the basic architecture of what the Union State does is, I think, totally sound in terms of mundane politics. We've got a serious problem with its institutional character at the moment, all of which is, for some reasons of some of the assumptions that Charles mentioned, all of which is a huge standing advantage to the SNP. And until something's done about that institutional context, we're going to be having this argument for the rest of recorded time.
Sure. Charles, you didn't want to come in on, no. A couple of questions have come in through the chat function. I think, well, the first one I think is a more rhetorical question from John McNally, the Scottish Nationalist Party Member of Parliament, asking, why did someone with a spine, i.e. Dennis Canavan, move to supporting an independent Scotland? I think that's aimed at Tom and the remark he had made. Another specific question aimed at Tom from Hannah Roger, who is the Westminster correspondent for the Herald newspaper, who says, does Tom think a different leader of Scottish Labour would improve the chances for the party at the Holyrood elections? And subsequently, if there's no change in leadership, what does he think their outcome will be in May 2021? That's a very specific question, Tom.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed out that Hannah's, I forgot that Hannah was a Herald correspondent, so I have to temper my answer now. I don't think it makes an awful lot of difference now about who leads Scottish Labour. I think they're going to have to write off May 2021, whoever leads them. The problem with Richard Leonard, who I actually think is a decent man, and was never really a Corbynite. You know, he's from the left, but he was never part of that kind of hard left caucus. I think his problem is that he's now seen as a busted flush. I think that the public tend to make a judgment about political leaders, and once they've made that judgment, they tend not to change their minds, fairly or unfairly. And I think people have made their minds up about Richard. So the question is, would his replacement by anyone, say Anna Sarwar or Jenny Mara, make a difference? At the margins, perhaps. But I think if Scottish Labour are going to recover in the longer term, it's not going to emerge in May. It's going to be well beyond that. They do need a new leader. And it's always better to replace a failing leader earlier than later, but I don't think it's going to have an awful lot of effect before May. Apart from anything else, because people are just talking about COVID, it's difficult to get traction on health, transport, the economy, whatever, when something like this is going on. But Jonathan, you said that the question from Mr. McNally was rhetorical. Can I just offer you a wee quick answer to that? Dennis Canavan, of course, is a spine. He wasn't the only Labour MP with a spine. There were 40-odd others. But what you found during the referendum was that the vast majority of support, there was very, very little support for independence in the Labour Party during the referendum. But where you got this, where the few people who did support independence were on the hard left, where the people from the kind of Corbynite tradition, who didn't have any affection or devotion to the Union, who disparaged British history, who saw the Union as an imperialist construct. Dennis came from that tradition. So the leap that he had to make from being a Labour MP to supporting independence was nowhere near as large as it was for most others. But there are lots of people in the Labour Party with a backbone and with principle who therefore oppose independence.
Sure. One thing that Charles said in his remarks early on was that he didn't think, you said you didn't think the UK government itself appreciated some of the differences of where the power lay and how to deal with things during COVID. I wonder what the panel think. There's an argument that the UK government should have invoked the Civil Contingencies Act and acted under that auspices in order to conduct some of the measures, which I think I'm right in saying would have prevented the devolved governments from being able to control certain of the measures and regulations. And also I wonder whether Daniel wanted to come back on that and perhaps reflect on his time as an advisor at the heart of government, working on the union and devolution policy, to just reflect on how well Whitehall and the civil service, as it was certainly when he was there, how they felt and how they understood and dealt with these issues.
Charles, I'll start with that just on Civil Contingencies Act. So that is not an issue that I've looked at particularly closely in relation to devolved versus reserved powers. I should say relatively persuaded by Lord Sumption's argument that the Civil Contingencies Act is what should have been relied on for the purposes of making the various regulations rather than the public health acts that were relied on. So I think there's a good case for saying that the Civil Contingencies Act should have been relied on. Now, I haven't looked at it, but I'm not sure off the top of my head that that would have precluded Scottish Government action. I think it would, I expect it would have formed a basis for the UK Government to act in Scotland and to make regulations for Scotland. But I think the Scottish Government's ability to make countermanding regulations would have remained in place. So under their existing public health legislation and under coronavirus legislation as passed at Westminster, and if that hadn't been passed, giving them the various public health powers, I think they probably could have passed legislation of their own. So I think actually that kind of illustrates a view of devolution that I often encounter in outside of Scotland, which is that because the UK Parliament is sovereign in the sense that it can legislate anything it wants for Scotland, and that is good law, that therefore the Scottish Parliament or Scottish Government become powerless in response to that. And actually, in the absence of powers being restricted, as happened in the European Union Withdrawal Act, in the absence of the Scottish Parliament's powers being expressly restricted by the same measure with which the UK Parliament acts, the Scottish Parliament is always able to act in response. We've never had a situation of legislative ping pong, but that is a possibility. So I think to some extent, the example possibly illustrates that the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government, within their fields of competence, actually do have very wide powers, and they have plenary powers. An act of the Scottish Parliament carries just as much weight as an act of the UK Parliament. And the principle of implied repeal means that the later, whichever is the later, takes precedence. So I think actually that is a good illustration of the point, and a good illustration of how you could get into a situation of competing powers that I think has been avoided, no doubt, to the chagrin of various members of the UK government.
So, Daniel, do you want to pick up on my point about how Westminster and Whitehall understand devolution and the different powers?
Very malicious question. Well, I mean, I'll preface this. Civil service is very big. There are some very good people and there are some not so good people. If there was a general atmosphere, it was that of a hospital ward composed entirely of people who'd been hit by buses. There were a lot of people, there still are a lot of people there who, you know, go back to the Scotland Act, which was meant to kill nationalism stone dead, who were heavily involved in the 2014 referendum, which was meant to be a resounding, spectacular rout of Alex Salmond's hopes and dreams. Neither of those things happened. In fact, rather radically the opposite. That, I think, had got a lot of people stuck in a kind of mindset of damage limitation, which I think speaks immediately to what Tom said. There wasn't much confidence in making unionist arguments, and I think that's still a problem. I also think that's connected to a wider problem, particularly inflamed by Brexit. And, you know, I think in terms of voting patterns, Brexit doesn't map onto Scottish independence terribly well, but there is quite an intimate connection among certain parts of the elite, might even call it the governing elite. Kind of saw Brexit immediately as a national catastrophe that had no plausible upside, and the idea that it would lead to the disintegration of the United Kingdom was a very convenient thing to add on to why it was inevitably such a bad thing. That in the aftermath of the 2016 vote, has been an absolutely toxic idea. You know, the number of times one hears in fashionable circles down in London, if I was Scots, I'd vote for independence now. That's a real problem. And of course, a problem that's based on an entirely abstract way of thinking. It's got nothing to do with the actual problems of government in Scotland. There's this kind of inability to, well, not an inability, there's a tendency to want to throw good money after bad. And even if you're in favor of the European Union, you have to recognize that as a union, it's a much less ambitious thing than what we have in the United Kingdom. It doesn't do the kinds of things that the British Union does. It's no alternative to it. The British Union is, in that sense, frankly, a superior piece of constitutional architecture. It's extremely alarming that so few people are willing to make that point. And that really needs to be brought very much into the psyche, even of people who were on the losing side in 2016.
Sure. Tom, did you want to come back on any of that?
No, that's okay. I think we'll just said all I want to say at the moment.
Okay. Say, if anyone wants to put a question, please put up your hand or write it in the chat section. I was intrigued to know what the panel thought of the recent suggestion from John Major, no less, that yes, there should be a referendum in Scotland. In fact, there should be 2 referendums in Scotland, on the basis that he thinks that that would be the way to stop an independence vote, in the way that he thinks if there'd been 2 referendums on Brexit, even if people have voted for it in a first referendum, they wouldn't have voted for it at the end of the process. Does anyone think that holds any water as an argument? Tom?
Not in the slightest. He has a good argument for asking former prime ministers to shut the hell up and stop talking about stuff they don't know anything about. You know, this idea, you know, that you can kill nationalism or you can defend the union by holding more referendums, or even by talking about more referendums. And I'm sorry if I come across as a bit of a blunt instrument, but you know, every time a senior politician talks about another referendum or more powers, it is simply capitulation to a nationalist agenda. There is no unionist agenda that concludes that more referendums are a good thing. I think, you know, every country in the world, especially developed democracies, have got the right to maintain the integrity of their own territory. But in Britain, people talk about British exceptionalism. British exceptionalism seems to stretch to the point where we alone indulge in constant debates and constant referendums about whether or not we hive each different parts of our nation off. America would never allow it. Most countries would never allow it. Spain doesn't allow it. But somehow if Britain doesn't allow it, we are unusual? No. If Britain doesn't allow it, that makes us very typical of any modern democracy in the world. And if John Major wants to make a contribution to this debate, you know, he spent most of the time since 2016 banging on about how awful Brexit was. Now he's banging on about giving the nationalists something that they want, which is another referendum. I mean, I'm sorry, I just have no patience for this nonsense.
Daniel?
I agree entirely. I think it pays to kind of game this through. So the idea would be there's a second referendum that comes back with a majority in favor of independence. Then we spend however many months or years in a negotiation between the SNP and the government in London, which is now taking an interest which is not that of the United Kingdom, but that of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Now that seems to me, if I was Nicola Sturgeon, like all of my Christmases have come early. It can hardly be said that the Brexit negotiations have increased the cultural fondness of British people for Brussels. And it's totally a naive suggestion. I get the rationale behind it, but it would be a catastrophe in political terms.
Charles, do you want to comment on that, or?
I don't think so, other than to say that it seems like it would be a strange way to engage in a negotiation, in that you would have the narrative would be partly what Daniel says, but also whatever you ended up with as a final quote unquote deal on which there would then be a referendum. The rhetoric would be, and not without foundation, it will change when things get serious. This is what the positions that have been set out, and in particular the UK government's position has been set out in order to try to defeat independence rather than to reflect what independence would actually look like. So I don't think you would actually get, I don't think it would achieve its purpose.
You know, also you've got former prime ministers opining on this issue.
Was it Gordon Brown intervened?
Well, I was going to talk about Gordon, and the one thing that's in common between him and what Major said is that, you know, you wish you had, you know, why didn't they have these insights when they were actually in power? I remember when Gordon was banging on about federalism, and Ruth Davidson said, "Oh, it's a wee shame that he was never in a position to actually introduce federalism." You know, and it's all very well for Gordon and Major to decide after they've left office, well, here's what I should have done. Well, you didn't though, and you didn't for a reason, because it'd have been dumb. And if it was dumb when you were prime minister, then it's dumb now. So, you know, honestly, it comes back to what I said about capitulation unionism.
Sorry, Daniel, go on.
I'm still waiting to hear what federalism means.
Yeah. Don't hold your breath. I mean, sorry, I'm going to give another rant here, Jonathan. I had this conversation with a former colleague who lost his seat on the same night as I did. And believe it or not, I am actually over it. I would never want to go back. But some of my colleagues who are younger than me are maybe do have an ambition to return to that for some reason. And I said to him, as I said in my original comments, you know, at what point do we accept that continuing to give more devolution and unbalance the devolution settlement in favour of Scottish Parliament? At what stage do we accept that it doesn't work, that it doesn't increase stability and it doesn't increase support for the union? The definition of insanity. Repeating the same action over and over again and expecting a different outcome. We have already had the Calman Commission, we've had the Smith Commission, we'll have more powers going, you know, when the Brexit is settled, and we are seeing the opposite effect. We're seeing increased support for independence. So what possesses people like Gordon Brown, who's an intelligent man, to believe that having, you know, a massive increase in powers for the Scottish Parliament will improve support for the, I just don't get it. Where's the evidence? This is what I mean. Where's the evidence? Show us the evidence that giving more powers to the Scottish Parliament increases support for the union. And if you show me that evidence, I will support it.
Daniel, Charles, did you want to come back on that? No, I don't think so. Is there anybody else who wants to put a question from within our illustrious audience before I bring things to a close? I don't think so, which means that we've run to extremely good time because the clock is literally about to chime 6 o'clock. So we've had a fantastic hour of discussion, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being part of this event. While the pandemic may have prevented us from holding physical events for the time being, of course, the benefit of Zoom is that we can have a gathering, bringing both panelists and guests together from literally the length and breadth of the kingdom, who otherwise may have struggled to all be in the same place at the same time. So I think this session has worked extremely well. Our speakers have given us much food for thought. As the cliche goes, you know, this debate is going to run and run, and I think over the coming months we're going to be hearing a lot more about it. So on behalf of all of you who've joined us, I'd like to thank each of our panel again for their participation in the event, and to thank you for attending. Enjoy the rest of your evening.